If you're interested in what I look like in real life and want to learn more about me, then follow my Instagram page at Joe the Insomniak. Hello everyone, sorry if I sound a bit different here, I've got quite unwell. I just wanted to say thank you for all of the kind messages of support, I really do appreciate them. Not much has really changed from the first time I was saying about this, but I'm still pressing on, so I just wanted to say thank you. When I was 12, a couple of months from 13, I was diagnosed with early onset bipolar disorder. I was really struggling around that time, and that was also around the time that I began middle school. I live in a rather sketchy part of my city. It has its nicer, wealthier parts, but we also have quite a bit of gang activity and such. My family has always been lower middle class, therefore, I gone to a pretty bad school. To keep it short, there was lots of gang activity, sketchy transactions in the bathrooms, and behind the buildings that were often overlooked. Homeless people hiding out in the woods behind the building. Pretty bad. Those were the 3 worst years of my life. I tended to attract toxic people living in that mindset. That's when I met Tanisha. I don't remember how we met. It seemed like she just appeared by my side one day during gym class. It turned out she lived in a little secluded place that branched off from my subdivision. And that little secluded place had its 2 parallel streets, and they always freaked me out. Now they're always very dark and surrounded by trees. I felt uncomfortable every time I would walk across into that part of the neighborhood. Now I believe it was my intuition. It started with strange stalking. I'd get home from school and she'd be at my mailbox. I'd come home from an errand and she'd call the home as soon as we pulled into the driveway. From day one, I immediately felt uncomfortable when around her, so why did I continue to go around her? I didn't really. I just never told her to leave me alone. I didn't initiate or welcome it ever. Again, I'm 13 and depressed out of my mind. We would go for walks sometimes and it'd turn into a casual offer to go hang out at her place. Every time I'd get near her home, standing in the road facing it for instance, I would immediately feel sick at my stomach, having this overwhelming feeling of dread. Casual offers turned into begging. The house appeared to be well maintained and landscaped, but she always told me about how her mother was an alcoholic and didn't take care of her or her little brother, and how she would sell herself on one of our main roads into the city. All of this could very well have been true, sure, but it didn't feel right. I felt like she was making up stories for attention. There's a rather large reservoir near my subdivision. During 7th grade, before turning 14, a young girl went missing. A week later, she showed up in the reservoir. Over 6 months or so of what I remembered, Tanisha would disappear for 4 days, every once in a while during them periods. A kid would go missing, ending up in the reservoir. I felt like it wasn't much of a pattern then, or else the authorities would have picked up on it. But on the other hand, this kind of attendance wasn't at all uncommon at my school. No one cared, honestly. I don't know. During the first week of November, she knocked on my window very early, around 3 AM if I remember correctly. She said that she had a birthday present for me waiting at her home, and she wanted me to come and get it. It was too big for her to carry all the way here. She sounded desperate, almost frantic. I said no, and when she said why, I told her that We had an alarm system that my mother would wake up with if I disarmed it. She then literally started begging for me to come with her. She wasn't at school the following day, and 2 or 3 days later, another kid shows up in the reservoir. There are gaps in my memory from those 3 years, partially because I was terribly unhappy. This was around the time I began working with my doctor. What I do remember though, is that she came to my home right after some snow had fallen, and my mother met her outside. My mother told her that if she ever come here again, she would call the police for stalking and harassment. Shortly after that, she's pulled out of school. As soon as the adult years go by, I said to my mother why she confronted Tanisha the way she did, hoping to get some concrete information. She said to me that she would have the overwhelming feeling of bad vibes when she come around. That's all she said. Now, I never had any concrete evidence that I wanted that Tanisha was responsible for the murders. Now, I'm not even sure if that's something that would be reported since she was so young, but I've always known she was responsible or involved in some way. I've learned over the years always trust your instincts. It seemed like a gradual downward spiral there at the end. The way she begged and frantically pleaded for me to go over. I honestly don't know what would have happened had I not followed my instincts that time.
When I was 19 years old, I worked at a summer camp as a counsellor and lived at the camp on weekends when there were no children present. Weekends weren't scary per se, but because everyone was more or less doing their own thing, they could put us a little on edge, being more or less alone. One Friday night, I went into town with 2 other young women who worked at the camp. We got back very late in the evening. There were 2 of us staying at the lodge, which is one of the first buildings you see as you enter the camp, and the other girl was staying in one of the cabins, which were about half a mile away, most of that walk through the woods. We begged her to stay in the lodge with us that night, because it was too late. She refused. We asked her to at least let us take the truck up there so she didn't have to walk. She likes walking at night, and the thought of the walk didn't scare her. We finally relented and let her go, asking her to call us when she got back in her cabin. 15 minutes after she left, we see lights in the driveway to the camp. It was a camper. My friend told me not to worry about it. There was a group coming to use the camp facilities for a week the next evening, and one of their leaders always brought her camper. She tended to arrive at weird times, so the fact that she was there at 3 AM was nothing. 10 to 15 minutes later, we hear someone at the door of the lodge, trying to get in. Our first order of business was to make sure it was locked tight, as there were a lot of people staying at the camp this particular weekend. Thinking that it's her, we go to the door, where we see a man standing there, trying to get in. Not knocking, simply trying to get in. Swallowing our fear, we go to the screen door, opening the non-screen door but leaving the screen door locked, and ask him what he's doing. He tells us he's looking for the Eagles campground. We actually got people arriving at the camp asking about that a lot, so we start giving him directions. At which point he says, "I can't hear you, open the door." To be clear, we're talking through a screen. There's no way his hearing was obstructed by the screen. He was just trying to get in. We tell him we can't do that, and if he tried to get in, we'd call the police. We repeated the directions. He left. We relocked the door and checked to make sure all the other doors were still locked. Content that the lodge was secure, we armed ourselves with butcher's knives because we were still a little scared. We heard him start up his camper. We looked outside and noticed he was driving into the camp rather than leaving. We tried calling the third girl, who was undoubtedly alone, but we got no answer. We tried calling our boss, but still no answer. It was at this point that we realised that he had come from the direction he said he had. He would have driven right by the Eagles campground, So why was he still here? We debated calling 911, but decided against it. We kept trying to call the girl from our camp group, but never reached her. We never saw him leave the camp, but in the morning our friend was okay, and we couldn't find his camper, so he must have left. Also, I just remembered something else. The following morning, after we checked up on the third girl, she had heard nothing and seen no sign of him, and discovered the camper was no longer on the property, meaning he left well after 4, and who knows how much of the camp he saw. We met up with some of the male counsellors, who had spent the night at the Eagles campground because they weren't allowed to drink on the camp property. They were all of age, and they told us that their tent had been set up by the entry to the campground, and that no one showed up after midnight, which makes it even creepier to think about. When I was 8 or 9 years old, I was good friends with a kid named Eric who lived down the same street from me. Still am, and we're in our late 20s now. We grew up in a somewhat rural but progressive area in Vermont. There's an IBM plant in town. The area is well educated and affluent compared to some. As such, there wasn't much for a kid to be scared of. On summer vacation, a bunch of us neighbourhood kids would hop on our bikes and spend whole days in the woods unsupervised, building forts and catching frogs until the sun went down. It was an awesome place to grow up. This particular summer, Eric's family invited me to his grandfather's camp. This is no problem for my parents. Our families have been friends for a while, and they're probably happy I won't be around to start fights with my younger sister for a few days. So I'm pretty psyched up about the trip. The camp is on a body of water, so there'll be water skiing, fresh fish, campsites and s'mores. The minivan is loaded up, Eric and his 2 younger siblings and myself, and the 4-hour drive passes without incident. I credit Eric's folks for their great patience in tolerating a car containing 4 annoying, single-digit age kids. On the way there, they made a point of explaining to me that one of the neighbouring camps there's a girl we need to watch out for. She apparently has some mental illness, is not quite right in the head somehow. I say got it. Not too worried since my 9-year-old self was still shy around girls my own age, much less older girls. They definitely had cooties. When we finally get to the camp, the place is even cooler than I expected. The building is huge. A bunch of Eric's relatives are also there. Forest to both sides, open water in front of us, and not another camp in sight. It doesn't get any better than this for kids who just want to run around in the woods or paddle around in a canoe, and that's exactly what we did for the first couple of days. I remember we caught a turtle that was smaller than a hockey puck, and pleaded with his parents to keep it. The weather was perfect. New England has some amazing summers, and this one was no exception. Fast forward a few days, we're having a cookout on the day before we have to go home. Some of Eric's uncles had gone out for that morning and caught a bunch of catfish, and we're grilling them up with burgers and hot dogs for dinner. I got bored waiting for the food to be ready, so I'm splashing around down by the water, skipping rocks out on the water. That's when I noticed something in the water, down the shore a ways. The trees obscured my view, so I wandered closer to investigate. Whatever it was headed in my direction. As I approached the tree line at the shore, I'm suddenly face to face with a stranger in a canoe about 10 feet in the water. There's a girl sitting in it by herself, and she waves at me. She's older than me, but not a grown-up, and looked normal enough. She starts talking to me, and doesn't seem too threatening. I am also curious about who she is, since I've been running around the woods and exploring the coast, and I know there aren't any other camps nearby. At one point I glance back, and most of the people milling around the grill have gone inside, so nobody spotted me at the edge of the property talking to this person. For some reason, I've either forgotten or ignored the advice previously given to me about avoiding a girl who fit this exact description. Looking back, I think she must have been manipulating my pre-adolescent brain, because the next thing she asked me is if I wanted to go for a ride in her canoe. It sounded like a fun thing to do, so I start wading out to the water to hop in her boat when I hear Eric's mum shouting at me very urgently, "Joe, it's dinner time, come inside now!" I really didn't think anything of it at the time, but when I recently discovered this subreddit, the memory popped up in my head. Looking back on it, I have no idea what would have happened if I'd gotten in the canoe with that girl. I can't help but think that my buddy's mum may have saved my life that day.
It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She didn't really like telling the story, since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To cut to the chase, the parents had spent a nice, if awkward first date, and around the time they would say goodnight, the male in the situation, my dad's friend, suggested they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place, since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. So the two drove up the mouth of the canyon, got out of their cars, and started hiking under the lights, just near the stars. At some point, the male starts getting a bad feeling, since a pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be very dark, and because it was getting quite late. He, however, manages to ignore the feeling and presses on. The female would say that she felt the same feeling at what was probably the same time, but she didn't know the trail like he did, putting it down to that. A minute later, the feeling came back to the male. He ignored it again, started walking a bit of the way into the trees with his foot hitting something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see just what this soft thing was. Then, the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what was under his foot, he and the female both agreed to hightail out of there. It was then only years later, after being married, they were watching an interview with the serial killer Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the time that he felt the closest to being caught, he explained about the night that he lured a girl into Provo Canyon and just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in some trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right out into the body, and for some reason, just turned around and walked away. So my friend's parents stumbled onto a fresh corpse left by Ted Bundy.
It was the fall of 2007, and I was 15, living in New York. I was a competitive athlete in high school, the type who got up before school for workouts and trained for long hours afterwards. With recruiting season a year away, I was under tremendous pressure to perform in my sport, as well as in the classroom. I was struggling to keep up in calculus at the time, so my mum suggested I get a tutor. She made an appointment with a teacher friend of hers who really knew his stuff. I'd been going to him regularly, probably 3 times a week for a month, before I met Alex. Alex had the tutoring session after mine, and we'd cross paths every week. It had never been more than a glance and a smile, and I was actually incredibly shy and terrified of boys. He was tall, blonde, with piercing blue eyes, so naturally, I thought he was cute. One day, my tutor had to change his schedule and decided to book us together, as we were learning the same topics in calc. I was shocked and delighted when Alex started chatting with me afterwards and asked for my phone number. I had never had a boy pay attention to me in that way, and I was flattered that someone cute wanted my number. Eventually, Alex and I began dating. Alex went to Catholic school in another town, but he lived in the same town as I did. He took the bus every morning from my school to his. This gave us most mornings together, and he was able to meet my friends. I was a little taken aback when they didn't take to him like I did. They mentioned him seeming weird, and I got super defensive, but I let it go. I realised I'd been spending less time with them than I normally did, and assumed they were jealous that I had a boyfriend. As time went on, things got more serious. We started experimenting, and eventually I lost my virginity to him in the back of his Ford Escape. That's when things began to change. While Alex and I regularly talked, he started getting over the top about staying in contact with me. He would ask me to stay on the phone with him all hours of the night, until eventually my mum started taking my phone before I went to sleep. This relationship also started taking a toll on my athletic career. I was too tired to spend my extra training time and started skipping my practices to see him, driving 30 minutes each way to his school. Eventually my friend sat me down and told me how unhealthy this relationship had become. I had isolated myself from them, and my entire free time was spent with him. At this point, I wanted so badly to end the relationship. I had fallen out of love with Alex, and college applications were approaching. I had been scouted by no less than 10 colleges, and my plan was to attend Brown, my dream school. Alex's obsession with our relationship had taken a huge toll on his grades, and Brown wasn't going to be an option for him. I remember when I told him that's where I was planning on going, and he freaked out, saying he would never get in and begged me not to go. At the time, I was also recruited by the University of Illinois. Alex applied there, in hopes that I would ditch Brown and go to Illinois with him. That was the final straw for me. I ended things there for good, assuming that would be it. Because Alex would take the bus from my school to his every morning, I had to see him. I remember walking into school past him and his classmates who took the bus with him, and some of his guy friends would yell awful things at me. I ignored it, until I started getting Facebook messages from random people in school. I spent months getting nasty messages from guys at his school, accusing me of having all sorts of things, and they were telling me that they were going to do terrible things to me. Eventually, I had to delete my Facebook because it wouldn't stop. I think deleting my Facebook was what set the stalker tendencies off for Alex. He wasn't able to see my face online, so he started calling non-stop and sending desperate AIM messages telling me he loved me. While this was going on, I was the favourite to win the high school championship in my sport. I had gone undefeated all season. Alex ended up showing up while I was competing for the championship, and I saw him there. It shook me so badly I ended up losing the title. I was furious and heartbroken. I ended up picking up his call that came that night and screamed at him, telling him to never contact me again. That's when the threats began. I got a call a few nights later from Alex. After he texted me he had something important to tell me. Stupidly I answered. He began to tell me how he was going to kill me. He was going to show up to my house when my parents were at work with a rope and knife and make me suffer like I'd done to him. I started to cry, and he eventually went on to say he was going to get me before I went into school because he knew exactly where I parked my car every morning, and my parents were never going to find me. At this point, I decided to record what was being said and had it taped on my phone. I hung up and felt he'd said enough. The next morning, I went into school extra early, much earlier than I figured he'd be there. I showed the advisor my recording, who then called my mum. I remember feeling a deep-rooted shame as my mum listened to the recording, like I'd done something to bring this on myself. My advisor was so alarmed by the recording, he advised me to go to the police. This day still feels surreal to me. My mum and I sat in the police station all day, explaining the story of my relationship with Alex and how it got to this point. The police then drove to his high school and arrested him while he was in class. The topper in the day, though, was when I went out to bring food back to the police station for my mum and I pulled into the station at the same time as a car holding Alex did. I saw him in handcuffs, and he indeed looked like he was going to do something to me. Post-arrest, I got a restraining order against Alex, and he was sent to a mental institution for a short while. He ended up breaking the RO on more than one occasion. I contacted the police, but they didn't think it was cause to do anything. I think it's important to know that Alex's family were wealthy and had a name in the area, so it wouldn't have surprised me if that's why they brushed it under the rug. I ended up attending Brown and had to inform them of the RO and let them know that Alex should not be allowed on campus. It's been over 10 years since this all happened, and I still receive friend requests and phone calls from him on occasion. I recently moved across the country from where this occurred. I finally feel safe now that I'm far away from where he lives. But anytime I get a blocked call or text from a number I don't know, a thought goes through my head that it might be him. It's safe to say that this experience has completely changed who I let in my life, and who I choose to date. Okay, so this could have been nothing, but something felt so off. Just for a bit of backstory, last night my sister, who lives 3 hours away from me, had somewhat of an emergency and asked if I could stay the night with her. I packed my bags right away and headed there at 9 PM. As I was about an hour away from my apartment, I realised that my car wasn't going to make it. The temperature gauge was rising, and I didn't want to risk it overheating in the middle of nowhere. So I turned around when I'm about 15 minutes from my home and my car overheats. At this point, it's about 11:30 PM. I pulled off at an exit and waited for it to cool down. Then I got back on the highway, but it did it again. So I pulled off onto the side of the highway. As I'm waiting for it to cool down, I tried to start it again, and it wouldn't start at all. I'm a 23-year-old female, all alone, in a new town, and my boyfriend was out of town, so I started to panic a little, because I read too many damn Reddit stories. I managed to calm down and call my stepdad to let him know where I was, and that I was going to call a tow truck. As I was on the phone to him, 2 cars pull off the highway right in front of me, and then one right behind me. My first thought was that they were going to help me, or that they were travelling together and needed to stop. But it was really weird to me that they pulled off at the same spot I did, with one pulling behind me. They all sat in the cars for what felt like forever, but it was probably only around 3 minutes. Then, a man got out of one of the cars in front of me, and started walking towards my car. He walked to the passenger side, stopped for 1 second, then walked to the car behind me. This whole time I'm describing what he looks like to my stepdad, just in case. He was then in that car for a while, and then walked back towards my car, and as he was passing my window, he hit it with his knuckle, knocking once as he kept walking. They sat there for a while, then all left at once. I'm realising as I'm typing that it doesn't sound that weird, but being alone on the highway with 3 cars pulled off in front of you and behind you, it's a suffocating feeling. I really don't understand why he felt the need to knock on my window as he was walking by. I'm not gonna lie, it made me cry because it was just so bizarre, and I was so helpless, God knows what could have happened to me.
I knew somebody who brought her home, and she was 99% sure it was a murder house. She brought the house for way under the market value in an upscale neighbourhood. The house was owned by a single old man. He insisted on giving her a private tour of the home before he moved out. He had carpet on all the walls. Even the bathroom was carpeted. There were locks on the outsides of the interior doors. He also had doors that had a cut hole out in the middle with a metal gate over it, so a cage. He even had a room that was dedicated to frogs, painted green, full of frog figures. After she moved in, she found a man's name written on the wall in the basement, along with some tally marks. Her telling me about this gave me goosebumps.
About 7 years ago, when I was 17, my parents went out of town for a weekend and left me at home. This was a pretty common occurrence. My parents trusted me. I would usually spend these weekends away staying with friends or family, as my parents' house is a bit creepy to being alone, even during the day. We live in a small rural town where everyone knows each other, and generally is pretty quiet and safe. Saturday, I was supposed to stay with a friend, but her parents decided at the last minute not to let me stay. It wasn't a big deal that I had to leave. I was somewhat prepared to have to go home, because her parents got weird about company sometimes. I left her house, which is about 15 minutes from my parents' house, around 9:30 or 9:45. While I was on the way home, I got a weird feeling that I really can't explain. I just knew that I didn't want to go stay at my parents' alone. I called my brother and asked if he could stay with me. At the time, he was living with a woman who had a small child. He told me it would be quieter and easier for him just to come and stay with me, since his dog would bark if I tried to come in the house. He said he would be at our parents' in 20 minutes. Side note that's relevant later. My brother's a relatively scary looking guy. He's about 6'3", 200 pounds, pretty muscular and covered in tattoos. After hanging up, I decided to stop at the gas station and grab a snack before going home, so my brother would be there when I got there. I pulled into the gas station. There were only a few cars in the lot, which is typical because this is a small town in the rural south, where everything pretty much stops after 8 PM. I park and walk up to the door. There was a man standing outside the door smoking. He opened the door for me without saying anything. This is normal southern hospitality, especially since I'm a female. I smiled and thanked him. Inside, there was another man standing by the door. I noticed him as soon as I came in. He gave me that gross up and down look and said something to the effect of, "Hey cutie, what are you doing here alone?" Creepy. I just ignored him and walked towards the back of the store. He yelled after me and called me the B word. I still ignored him. I figured he was drunk or just high or just an idiot. Most people around here talk a big game, but rarely back it up. I wasn't scared, just annoyed. I got my snacks and paid at the counter. When I got to the door, both men were gone. I was happy not to deal with them anymore. I began walking across the lot towards my car, which was probably about 100 feet from the door. As I was walking, I looked down at my phone to see if enough time had passed for my brother to be at my parents'. When I looked up, the idiot who had hit on me was standing at the pump staring at me. I looked at him for a second and continued walking. "Hey, you know you're supposed to answer a man when he speaks to you," he said. I remember saying something snarky back to him and getting in my car. He looked annoyed at my sarcasm. I locked my doors as soon as I got in my car, started it, and was thinking nothing but getting home and eating my snacks, and I could hang out with my brother then. I put my car in gear and realised the man had disappeared. I looked around before pulling out my parking spot, only to realise that both men were sitting in a car facing mine across the lot. They were both staring at me and talking, occasionally even pointing towards me. I just stared at them, defiant and annoyed. I didn't want them to think I was scared. Whilst we was having our staring contest, the man who had opened the door for me smiled and gave me the finger across the throat gesture, as in, "You're done." I rolled my eyes and pulled out the gas station, annoyed. To my dismay, they pulled out behind me. I hadn't been scared up until this point, because, as I said, most people hear a lot of talk with no follow through. Instead of going home, I took a few back roads that connect back in a sort of circle to see if they were really following me, which of course they were. When they realised I was testing them, they drove up really close to me and started laying on the horn. I couldn't see their headlights, they were so close. I called my brother and told him what was going on. He told me to come home and that he would handle it. I started driving home. The two idiots were still behind me blowing the horn. Even with my detours, I was only 3 or 4 minutes from my parents' house. I slowed down to pull into the driveway and was immediately relieved. At the end of the driveway was my brother, standing shirtless, with his shoulders back, hands crossed in front of his stomach, clearly holding a pistol, his intimidating looking pit bull sitting by his side. I drove round into the yard. The two guys actually started to pull in behind me until they saw my brother. Then they hightailed it out there. I have no idea what they would have done if I'd stopped somewhere alone or just kept driving. I always think fondly of the image of him standing there, ready to protect me. I'm thankful he was there. I live in a moderately rural home with my sister and brother, so it's not like we have next door neighbours. but there are a few homes nearby. One night recently, I follow my usual route wherever my brother and sister are both working. They both work night shifts, and I'm home alone. I turn on Netflix and fall asleep on the couch. I fall asleep around 10 PM or so, guessing by the last episode I remember watching fully. I wake up to this banging on the door. Look at the clock and it's 11:06. Bleary-eyed, I walk to the door, thinking maybe my brother got sent home early from work and forgot his house keys. Through the glass door, thankfully it's distorted, so I don't think the person saw me. I see what appears to be a 20 to 40 something man without his t-shirt on, banging on my door. At this point, I freak out and call my mum. I'm an adult, but not very independent. I left the TV on, and there's a fan running, but from down the hall, I can still hear them banging on the door. And I can see a flashlight or a phone light shining into the house. I'm not going to answer the door in the middle of the night. My mum wakes my dad and sends him over. They live across town. I'm so freaked out by this person just banging on the door in the middle of the night, and I stay on the phone for what seems like forever. My mum heads over in her car, so she has to hang up. Around 20 minutes later, my dad pounds on the dark back door, and I let him in, and he goes out to the front to speak to these people. I look out the window and see that it's actually a 50-something mum with her 2 teenage sons and more people in their car. Turns out these people say they're looking for a dog. They say, "We're good people, and we're not those kinds of people." My dad talks to them, and they won't leave until a cop comes with a warrant to search the house for their dog. I tell them that I haven't seen their dog. There's lots and lots of almost packs of dogs that go around the area all the time. So now they're trespassing. They taunt my dad and say, "We just want to look inside. Why won't you just let us in? Are there drugs?" At this point my mum arrives and we hang out, and the situation outside is getting heated. We wait a little while thinking they called the cops, but it turns out they want a cop friend of theirs from a city 2 hours away to come and search our house. Hell no. So my mum calls 911 and gets transferred to the police office, and around 12:20 or so a cop arrives. That's fast. I have a few reservations since I don't own the house, but I don't want to go through all the hassle of him getting a warrant, and I want these people off the property. The cop says, "I don't know why you're like this." What, not wanting strangers in the house? He searches the house, but there's clearly no dog in there. The cop talks to the people and they walk off into the night. I didn't mention that whoever was driving their car drove off. I pack my bag and go to sleep in my parents' house. The cop stays outside the house in his car, and we lock up and leave. Other stuff. My phone is on different phone towers than my siblings, so I barely get any signal at the house, and I have to use FaceTime to make any calls. 911 can't be used on FaceTime. I doubt these people are looking for their dogs, and I don't know what they would have done if they got into my house. A few years ago, I worked at a Jewish summer camp in North Georgia. As many of you might know, Georgia is a fairly conservative state, as well as being predominantly Christian. There are small Jewish communities and a few summer camps. I'd say this camp was more culturally Jewish than it was religious. There were no religious requirements, nor religion-specific focus. Rather, it was a place for kids who were more often in the minority to come to camp that allowed them to meet other kids like them. Staff came over from all over. We had many Australians, lots of Brits, a few Israelis, and people from various areas of the USA. Each night at around 10, most of the staff was able to go out to the town for a couple of hours. Enough staff remained behind to watch over the cabins. We rotated. This particular night, a group of 5 of us decided to go to a local bar to grab a few beers. It had been a hot day and was a humid night, so we decided to sit outside on the patio. For some backstory on the town, generally we were extremely well received by the community, despite differences. We brought in lots of revenue for the town during the summer. We brought supplies at the local Walmart and often took the campers on tubing trips or occasionally out for dinner after a long hike on the Appalachian Trail. It was midsummer, so we'd been out to the bars in the area many times already that season. The 5 of us sat around a table, drinking and discussing the events of the day, as fellow employees typically would after work. About 30 minutes in, a white man in his 20s came up to our table. I distinctly remember a jagged scar on his cheek, but didn't think much of it at the time. He introduced himself, then told us he was having a party that night at his place. "Anyone can come," he said. "Black, white, gay, straight." I found it odd that he'd open his speech with that disclaimer. Of course a party would be open to anyone. Why did he feel the need to specify? But we'd all had a few beers and were feeling pretty loose. He talked for a bit longer, and nothing really seemed off. We told him we were working at a camp in the area and couldn't stay out, so we would probably be heading back soon. An hour later, our group went out to the parking lot to get in the car. As we approached it, we saw the same guy come out the shadows. He had a buddy with him with a shaved head. His expression was incredibly hateful. His eyes had changed. He pounded his fist into his hands, then took off his shirt and revealed a poorly inked SS tattoo. My stomach dropped. One of the bigger guys in my group, Kevin, immediately reacted by pulling a knife out his back pocket. At summer camp, most of the staff carried knives. We spent a lot of time building campfires, etc., and asked what they wanted. The original guy started shouting some anti-Semitic remarks and told us he was going to beat us down. Kevin started walking towards the 2 guys, but we pulled him back. He told us his buddies were on the way. Sure enough, some more guys started walking into the parking lot. It's all kind of blurry here. I remember jumping into one of the cars, pulling Kevin with us. It felt like we were surrounded, though there were probably only 7 or 8 of them. Rocks were thrown at the car. We sped off. My heart was beating like crazy. We never went back to that bar. On the bright side, when we told the story to the competing bar in town, the bartender lined up 6 shots, cheered us and said we'd always be welcome in his bar in that town. Had no more problems in the town itself, but when I took some campers on a 2-day hike up the Appalachian Trail, it was another story.